Welcome to Love Lies Chronicles.
I wouldn't say it started that evening, but that's when I noticed the point of no return had been quietly crossed. It was a Thursday. Not particularly good or bad, just one of those middle-of-the-week days where routine takes over. I'd wrapped up work a little early and thought maybe we could do something simple together, order Thai, crack open a bottle of that Cabernet she liked, just sit on the couch and talk like we used to. I wasn't planning a romantic evening, not even trying to seduce her. I missed the version of us that used to feel like home. She was in the kitchen scrolling on her phone when I came in. No hello. No glance up. I mentioned dinner. She gave a half shrug and said, "Order whatever." So I did. Pad CEW for me, green curry for her. I set the table anyway, even though I knew we'd probably end up eating in silence. Old habits. I tried to make conversation, mentioned a funny email thread at work, asked how her project was going, but she nodded or mumbled responses. Eventually, I gave up trying to make it feel like anything more than cohabitation. We ate, cleaned up separately, and I assumed the night was ending. But as I was walking past her on the way to the bedroom, I paused. Not for any big reason. I was thinking maybe we could just, I don't know, spend some time together. I said. Nothing big. Maybe talk in bed, lie down for a bit. Be close. She didn't look up from her phone. Why? That word hit harder than it should have. I wasn't making demands. I wanted to feel some thread of intimacy again. Some reassurance that we were still partners. That there was still something left to build on. I took a slow breath, tried to explain. I just feel like we've been drifting a little. I miss the closeness we used to have. Finally, she set her phone down and looked at me. Her expression was unreadable, like I'd said something utterly foreign. "I don't owe you that," she said flatly. At first, I thought I misheard her. "What?" Her tone sharpened, like she was gearing up for a well-rehearsed line. I said, "I don't owe you that. I'm not obligated to meet your physical or emotional needs because we're married." There was no heat in her voice. Just cold, deliberate dismissal. Like she was teaching me a lesson I'd somehow missed all this time. "I'm not asking for anything you don't want to give," I replied carefully, trying to keep the conversation from spiraling. "I wanted to reconnect. Feel like we're still, a couple." She stood then, slowly, arms crossed like I was on trial. "You men always think that because you're decent or hardworking or loyal, that you're entitled to my body or my affection. I've grown past that. I'm not here to fulfill your needs. If that's a problem, maybe you need to reflect on what kind of partner you really are." It felt like a closure I hadn't been consulted on. She walked past me, headed to the bathroom, shutting the door with the kind of finality that didn't require a slam. Just a click. I stood there, unsure of what to do with myself. The house was silent, save for the low hum of the fridge and the creak of wood settling. My hand was still resting on the doorframe, the other in my pocket, thumb nervously flicking my keys. I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. Every moment from the past few months replayed themselves with perfect clarity. The dodged conversations, the mechanical responses, the subtle recoil when I reached for her hand. It hadn't been obvious when it started, but it was glaring now. This was a shift in how she viewed me. I couldn't ignore how calculating it all seemed. She was certain, like she'd made this decision weeks ago and had just been waiting for the right opportunity to deliver it with surgical precision. I thought back to the early years of our marriage, the long walks, spontaneous road trips, the way she used to fall asleep with her head on my chest. It felt like remembering a different person entirely. That woman didn't exist anymore. Or maybe she never had. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, arms folded across my chest, not out of comfort, but as a barrier. What I felt was emptier than sadness. A recognition that something had quietly died, and I hadn't even noticed the funeral. She returned to the bedroom later, brushed her teeth, climbed into bed, and turned off the light. Not a word. Not a glance. That was the night I stopped asking for her time. I didn't say anything the next morning. She hummed to herself while making coffee, as if we hadn't exchanged the most honest words of our marriage the night before. As if telling your husband you owe him nothing was just another part of the morning routine. I went to work that day and didn't check in with her like I usually did. A few days passed, maybe a week. The air between us wasn't cold, it was absent. Like a vacuum sealed shut around the last traces of partnership. We still shared the same rooms, slept in the same bed, made the same small talk around bills and groceries. But something essential had been shut off, and I was the only one who seemed to notice it was missing. What struck me wasn't just the withdrawal of affection, it was the way she carried herself afterward, lighter somehow, freer. Like she had dropped a burden. And I realized then, That burden had been me. One evening I got home later than usual. I'd stayed behind at work, pretending to catch up on documents, but I didn't want to go home. The thought of sitting across from her in silence was heavier than anything waiting at my desk. When I finally walked in, she was on the phone in the kitchen, laughing. That easy, relaxed laugh I hadn't heard in months. I stepped into the hallway quietly, not eavesdropping, just hesitant to interrupt. She hadn't noticed me yet. "Oh, it's going better than I expected," she said. "I think he's finally adapting to the new normal. Less needy. It's almost like training a puppy. Give it less attention, and it stops begging." She laughed again, a sharp burst this time. "No, seriously. I read this article that said men need to be reconditioned. Physical detachment resets their dependency patterns. It's biology." I froze. Every part of my body stiffened, like my muscles refused to believe the words floating toward me from the kitchen. There was a pause, then a chuckle. "Well, he hasn't protested lately. I think he's still in that hopeful phase, waiting for things to turn around. But I'm not backtracking. I'm doing this for me. For my peace." She turned around then and spotted me. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't flinch. She held my gaze as she said, "Okay, gotta go. He's home." Then she ended the call, set her phone down, and offered me a small, unreadable smile. "How was work?" I nodded. "Fine." Dinner that night was quiet. She sat across from me like nothing had happened. She talked about a podcast, mentioned a coworker's birthday coming up. I stared at my plate, pushing food around without appetite. Every so often, she'd glance at me, probably checking to see if I was going to crack, if I'd challenge her. The next day, I messaged someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Laura, her college friend, someone who used to visit us often before moving out of state. Laura had always struck me as level-headed. Not someone to gossip, but not blind either. I kept the message simple. Asked how she was doing. Mentioned I'd been thinking about how long it had been since we all caught up. She responded warmly. We exchanged a few polite updates before she casually asked, "Hey, how are you two doing? I heard from Danielle you were going through a redefinition phase or something." I paused at the screen. "Danielle, my wife's sister. What did she say exactly?" I replied. Laura took a moment, then, "Nothing bad. Just that she's evolving, setting boundaries, reclaiming space in the marriage. Something about intimacy being overrated." I didn't want to pry. I thanked her, said we were figuring things out, then ended the conversation as politely as I could. The moment I closed the chat window, it hit me. This wasn't private. She was making a performance of it, spinning our decline into her growth narrative. She was reframing it as empowerment and inviting others to applaud. It was no longer about disconnection. It was about control. That night, as she scrolled through her phone beside me in bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt something settle deep inside. I was starting to see the shape of what I'd been pulled into. And for the first time, I considered the possibility that the problem wasn't the loss of affection, but the slow erasure of personhood. I was being reduced. 2 days later, I sat across from a therapist. I didn't tell her everything at first, just the surface stuff. The emotional distance, the feeling of living in parallel rather than partnership. She nodded quietly, asked measured questions. Her voice was calm, patient, without judgment. When I finally described that kitchen phone call and how my wife referred to me as if I were something to be reshaped, the therapist leaned forward slightly. Not shocked, just focused. "Can I ask something?" she said. "How does it feel to be in a relationship where your emotional or physical needs are framed as liabilities?" She continued, gently. "People stay in systems that harm them because they hope things will revert. But hope becomes a trap when it keeps us somewhere we're no longer safe." I nodded slowly. Not in agreement, but in recognition. I left her office that day without any dramatic epiphany. But something had shifted. Back home, my wife barely looked up as I walked in. She asked if I could pick up paper towels next time I was out. I said sure. The following weeks passed with deceptive ease. On the surface, not much had changed. I still made coffee in the morning, still folded laundry on Sundays, still picked up groceries without complaint. She continued her routines, airing out her self-improvement podcasts during yoga, scheduling brunches that never included me, posting subtle captions about boundaries and balance like she was curating a personal brand. But underneath that calm exterior, I was reorganizing my world. I began with the simplest things, practical, invisible changes that didn't register to anyone but me. I opened a new checking account at a different bank, rerouted my direct deposit, started paying attention to documents I used to sign without reading, The financial invisibility I'd once accepted out of trust was now a liability I couldn't afford. She didn't notice when I stopped offering to refill her prescriptions or book her appointments. She didn't question why I no longer reminded her about deadlines or carried in her packages from the porch. Maybe she thought I was sulking. It wasn't revenge. I just stopped volunteering for a role I hadn't agreed to anymore. Around this time, I began to journal. Not the emotional kind with dated entries and dramatic monologues, but a record of sorts: what was said, what wasn't, what was implied. Conversations where she dismissed concerns with a raised eyebrow, moments where I'd voiced discomfort and she'd deflect it with buzzwords or condescension. I documented patterns. Because I'd started to realize something. She was cultivating a narrative. A version of events where she was the evolved spouse and I was the emotionally dependent relic. And if it ever came to conflict, she'd reach for that narrative like a ready-made defense. So I made sure I had one too. Not to battle her, but to protect myself from the stories she might try to tell in my absence. I started seeing the therapist more regularly. Each session peeled away another layer I hadn't realized I was carrying. I wasn't just grieving the loss of intimacy or connection. I was coming to terms with the reality that I'd been living with someone who saw herself as enlightened for discarding basic partnership. In one session, I brought up something that had gnawed at me for weeks. She calls it growth, I said, staring down at the grain of the wooden coffee table. But none of it feels like something we built together. It's all hers. Her language, her framework, her decisions. The therapist was quiet for a beat, then spoke in that soft, deliberate way that never felt performative. There's a difference between growth and disengagement. One builds bridges. The other burns them and calls the ashes wisdom. That sat with me longer than anything else she'd said. At home, her comments grew bolder. Subtle at first, then not. "You've been calmer lately," she said once while drying her hair. "I think the space is finally working. You're learning to function without needing me." I smiled slightly. She mistook it for agreement. But what I felt wasn't compliance. It was detachment. There's something about truly letting go, not in the way people say after a fight, but in the quiet, irreversible sense of realizing someone doesn't want the version of you that actually exists. I stopped correcting her when she twisted my words. Stopped defending myself when she made subtle digs during conversations with others. Stopped clarifying the truth when she reinterpreted past events through the lens of her newfound narrative. Let her have the illusion. I was no longer in it. Then one evening, a text from her sister, Danielle, appeared on my phone. We hadn't spoken in months. We'd never been close, but she always struck me as observant, too observant for my wife's liking. "I know it's not my place, but I feel like I should say something," it began. I read the message twice. She'd overheard my wife on a phone call with one of her friends. Apparently, they'd been laughing about how easy it had been to reshape the marriage dynamic. How men could be retrained through deliberate withdrawal. How the absence of sex, support, or affection was a form of empowerment. A reset button. She ended the message with, "I thought she was going through something, but now I'm not sure. Be careful." I didn't respond, because I was grateful someone had finally acknowledged what I'd been living in. That night, while she was asleep, I walked around the apartment with my phone's flashlight, taking pictures. Furniture, art, receipts, insurance documents, anything that might matter later. The next day, I contacted a lawyer, not to file anything, not yet, but to understand the terrain, to know what I'd face if I decided to leave. The lawyer was straightforward, professional. We didn't talk about feelings, just facts. By the end of the meeting, I had a roadmap. Back home, I started sleeping closer to the edge of the bed. I kept a go bag in the trunk of my car. She didn't notice that I stopped wearing my wedding ring. I wasn't hoping for a turnaround. I was gathering the tools I needed to exit a structure that no longer recognized me. We were in the middle of unloading groceries when she delivered the final push without realizing it. I had just set a carton of eggs on the counter when she looked up from her phone and said, "You know, I think this version of us is actually healthier. We don't force things anymore." She said it so casually, as if she were commenting on the weather. A brief nod to her supposed wisdom. I kept putting food away in silence, already knowing what would happen the following evening. I had scheduled everything with quiet precision. No outbursts. No arguments. Just clean steps, one after the other, like following instructions for disassembling a piece of furniture you no longer had to use for. The next day, I left work an hour early. Drove to a notary's office, signed documents I had reviewed 10 times already, and had them sealed. Then I stopped by the apartment we used to rent before we bought the condo. An empty unit happened to be available, and I'd quietly put down a deposit weeks prior. I dropped off a single suitcase, just enough for her to have what she needed for the short term. Back home, she was in the living room, scrolling again, feet tucked under her on the couch. She barely glanced up when I entered. "You're home early," she said, voice indifferent. I walked over to the kitchen table and placed a manila envelope in the center. "What's that?" she asked, frowning slightly. "Read it." She unfolded the flap, pulled out the papers, and skimmed them quickly. Her frown deepened, then disappeared altogether, replaced by something unreadable. "Separation?" she asked, more stunned than angry. "You're serious?" I nodded. "Because I didn't sleep with you? Because I set boundaries." I didn't flinch. "Because this isn't a marriage. It hasn't been for a long time." I finally stopped pretending it could be something else. She stood now, holding the papers loosely in one hand, as if unsure what to do with them. "You're abandoning me over sex?" The room was still. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. I walked over to the coffee table and placed a second envelope beside her. Inside were copies of account transfers, utility change notifications, and the keys to the rental apartment. "I'm not abandoning anyone," I said. "You made choices for yourself. I'm doing the same." She let out a sharp laugh, humorless and brittle. "Wow, so this is your big rebellion? Leaving me? You think that makes you strong?" I didn't answer, because her words didn't need refuting. She looked at the documents again, then back at me. What happened to working through things? To commitment? I could have reminded her of the countless conversations I tried to have. The pleas for honesty. The evenings I spent questioning my own worth. "Commitment goes both ways," I said simply. "You stopped showing up." I just finally took the hint. Her voice rose now, trying to find traction. "You're overreacting. You're throwing everything away over a dry spell and a few arguments. This is what modern relationships look like." I stayed still. She scoffed and shook her head. "You'll regret this. You'll end up alone, bitter, blaming me." That was the moment I realized how deeply she believed the story she had written. One where she was the enlightened woman transcending outdated expectations, and I was the fragile man too weak to handle her brilliance. I walked to the bedroom, pulled the small duffel bag I had packed from the closet, and slung it over my shoulder. She followed behind me, questions pouring out now, accusations, confusions, desperate attempts to pull me back into the script. "What am I supposed to do?" she snapped. "Just move into some stranger's apartment and figure it out alone?" I turned to her once more, hand on the door. "You already have been. You didn't notice I wasn't part of it." And then I left. There were no slamming doors, no shouting, just the soft click of finality as the lock caught behind me. I drove in silence. No music, just the steady rhythm of tires on pavement, the kind of sound that doesn't fill space but clears it. The rental apartment was small, clean, empty, quiet. I set down my bag, sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, and exhaled in a way I hadn't realized I hadn't been able to for months. Outside, the city continued as if nothing monumental had happened. But for me, that silence meant everything. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for her to understand me. I had finally understood myself. The first call came 2 days after I left. I let it ring until voicemail picked up. Her voice was brisk, calculated. "We should talk. There are practical things to sort out. I'm willing to be mature about this if you are." The second voicemail was colder. "You're being petty. We had an arrangement, a structure that worked. If you'd rather burn it down because of your ego, that's your choice. But don't expect sympathy." Still, I said nothing. By the end of the week, her tone changed. The third message started with silence. Then, quietly, "I didn't think you'd really go through with it." That time, I almost called back. Almost. Instead, I replayed the last 6 months in my mind. Her scorn, the dismissals, the public posturing of emotional superiority while she slowly chipped away at every remaining trace of affection. I reminded myself how often I had reached for understanding, only to be met with smirks or lectures disguised as enlightenment. I spoke to the lawyer again. We outlined next steps. I provided the documentation I had been quietly compiling, including messages, shared account records, and timelines of key moments. He reviewed everything carefully. "You did your homework," he said. "There won't be much she can dispute." The silence I had once filled with second guesses now housed resolve. A week later, I received a text from her sister, Danielle. I tried to stay neutral, but I'm sorry. I didn't know how far she'd take it. That was it. No elaboration. None was needed. Friends began reaching out too. A few of her old college friends who used to visit us on weekends sent brief messages, Mostly some version of, didn't see that coming. Or if you ever want to talk, I'm here. Apparently, she was telling people I had abandoned the marriage because I couldn't handle her personal growth, that I had freaked out over her reclaiming space and became emotionally distant, that I had created a toxic atmosphere she had tried to salvage until I chose to run away. It would have hurt, maybe a year ago. But now I felt indifferent. People can say what they want. The truth doesn't need applause. It needs to be lived. I stayed in the rental for about 6 weeks. Long enough to give myself breathing room, distance, time to fully understand that I wasn't just reacting, I was building something new. I didn't jump into any new relationships. I focused on restoring the parts of myself that had been slowly erased while I smiled through a life that had stopped recognizing me. She tried again once, showed up at my office, unannounced. Security called before letting her through. I walked out into the lobby. She looked tired. Not unwell, just diminished. Like the power she once wielded so effortlessly had nowhere left to land. You don't have to act like a stranger, she said. She shifted her weight. I didn't think it would get this far. I studied her face for a long moment. Not out of longing or nostalgia, but to confirm something. To see if she finally understood. I'm not angry, I said. She looked confused. I'm not punishing you. I'm just not willing to keep shrinking to fit inside something that stopped being a relationship the day you decided your needs were real and mine were optional. Her lips parted slightly. No sound came out. I hope you find what you're looking for, I added. I really do. Then I turned and walked away. She didn't follow. I finalized the divorce quietly. No scorched earth. Just filings, signatures, and clean closure. The condo was sold. Assets were divided per the agreement. We didn't fight over keepsakes or furniture. What I took with me wasn't tangible anyway. I moved into a smaller place, a bit outside the city. Nothing fancy, just a clean space with good light, quiet neighbors, and a view of the sky in the evenings. One afternoon, months later, I sat on the porch drinking coffee when an old friend stopped by. We hadn't seen each other in a while, and after the greetings and catch-up, he asked gently, "Do you ever regret walking away?" I thought about it for a while before answering. I regret how long I stayed hoping things would change. I regret making myself small so someone else could feel big. But walking away? No. That was the first real act of love I gave myself in years. He nodded. Later, as he left, I remained seated, watching the slow fade of sunlight across the horizon. There was no dramatic finale, no swelling music, no grand revelations. Just quiet. A kind of silence that didn't suffocate, but healed. She had rewritten the story in her head to make herself the hero. But I no longer lived in that book. I'd started a new one. One with fewer pages dictated by fear of loss and more written by clarity, respect, and peace. And I didn't need anyone's permission to keep writing it. Not anymore.
Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.